This is an overview of the OLI course, Performing CRUD Operations on the DOM using JavaScript, which was built for the Programmable User Interfaces course, lab assignment number 6. The motivation for this course started out with an intention to build something that taught students HTML and CSS, but when it was discovered that the PUI course required assistance in scaffolding students' knowledge to succeed in lab assignment number 6, its scope was changed to teach HTML and JavaScript. The reasoning behind this was that the Introduction to Python course, which is required for all PUI students, does not teach skills and concepts that transfer well to JavaScript. Instructors have a difficult time reinforcing the concepts which connect HTML to JavaScript and teaching how they interact. My objective was to align the instructional goals of this course to students' difficulties in PUI Lab Assignment 6, reinforce the learning objectives that were established with formative and summative assessment questions, and teach students enough so that they have near transfer to the PUI Lab Assignment number 6. The initial goals are defined here. You can see that there are two dispositional goals that I wanted to reinforce in students, in that they would be confident in debugging problems that may arise when debugging the DOM, and be knowledgeable about and be able to communicate the issues involved with designing and building web standards. The rest of these concepts and skills map to the requirements for PUI Lab Assignment 6, and we'll see how those have changed over the course of the design of this module. These objectives were formally defined as concepts, skills, and dispositions, and put into the OLI, or Open Learning Initiative, skill bank and learning objective lists, so that students' assessment and performance tasks were aligned with the objectives of the course and of the lab assignment. So one of the changes that was made along the course of the development of this module was the second to last item in this row. All of these questions map to a Google Forms questionnaire that was completed before the instruction was designed. However, it was revealed eventually that finding out how the methods or attributes of an object can be uncovered was a very complicated KC that was outside the scope of this project. Further refinement of goals and assessment involved interviewing a PUI student who had recently completed lab assignment number 6. The student stated that they looked at the documentation and played around a lot when presented with a problem they didn't know how to deal with, indicating that they did not have a strategy for dealing with bugs when they were doing lab assignment number 6. They also did not learn the concepts of loose or strict equality, and did not learn how to convert variable types when taking the PUI lab course, which are two key concepts for succeeding in the completion of this lab assignment. Eames Isle here on the right was the performance task foundation for this OLI module. Students are instructed to figure out how to update the shopping cart count when they click on the add button, and there are a whole host of KCs that go into doing that in JavaScript and HTML. Further refinement of goals and assessment for this course involved talking to a PUI lab TA. This TA suggested, upon viewing the Google Forms questionnaire, that the personalization principle be applied to formative and summative assessments, and so it was. They also asked to incorporate comprehension questions such as the output of certain code, and so I incorporated worked examples throughout this instruction. They also advised to include some debugging tasks, which was outside of the scope of this module. However, I included some scaffolding 3/4 of the way through the completion of this module for variable types and conversion, as the student indicated that was a challenge when completing this assignment. As stated before, scope, and modifying the variable types within and outside of a function were relevant to the completion of lab assignment number 6, but is outside the completion of this module. And further debugging tasks were also outside the scope of the development of this module, so those items were removed from the assessment. Cognitive task analysis was conducted. You can see on the left the results of the empirical cognitive task analysis and the initial theoretical design on the right. It was found that experts may have commands memorized and they may store elements and variables when dealing with a complex coding task in JavaScript. Experts are familiar with the terminology such as event listeners and may refer to the documentation in looking up these bits of code that are not necessarily memorized. Furthermore, the retrieval of text content within an HTML element, or P2, as a skill was taught to students, and P3, or applying methods for variable type conversion, was reinforced in cognitive task analysis as something that is absolutely critical and may require looking up the documentation to accomplish. P4, which is a complex skill, incorporated both P0 and P2, and students seem to succeed on this in the pretest and on the post-test because they may have been primed during the assessment. And this was pretty consistent throughout the development of this instructional module. And lastly, this item was removed from the eventual instructional module. However, IDE autocomplete, console autocomplete, or looking up the documentation were taught to students as a result of experts doing these actions when they were solving problems in expert CTA. The other results of the expert CTA included applying pre-training principles, so overview of the document object model, or DOM, was taught to students during instruction. They were taught to refer to the documentation, and the advice from the PUI lab TA was also incorporated. This is the final iteration after multiple iterations of the assessment. It was eventually determined when applying the rows on the left to the assessment and instruction that scope needs to be its own module. You can see on the bottom of that list that it is starred, indicating that it is outside the scope of the development of this instructional module. The course was then implemented in accordance with multimedia learning principles, such as the pre-training principle. That was where the DOM was taught. You can see a picture of the DOM there on the right. The personalization principle in addressing the student throughout the videos and also throughout some of the questions. The modality principle was applied in that I spoke throughout the instruction to tell students what I was doing, sort of think aloud task. It's within the instruction. The segmenting principle was applied in that I split up videos so that learners could be more self-paced and reduce their cognitive load while internalizing concepts. And the coherence principle was applied because CSS was mentioned but not elaborated upon throughout the lesson because it was outside the scope of teaching how HTML and CSS connect to each other. The innovative principle within this lesson was discovered when I watched a special interest group for computer science education keynote delivered by Mark Gosdile of the University of Michigan's Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. He presented a talk on computational literacy and the work of Dale Parsons and Patricia Hayden, where they came up with something called Parsons problems, which are basically refrigerator magnet problems, where students may not struggle as much with the syntax but internalize the concepts of development in the language that they are in. And these Parsons problems can definitely be expanded beyond what you see in this formative assessment here. The final instructional design you can see on the left paired with the Eames Isle activity, which was conducted throughout the instruction. We start off with an overview of the DOM, continue to reading and updating it. There's a brief detour to variable types in JavaScript, and then we put it all together in the final module before the summative assessment. After creating this instructional module, I spoke to two students. The first student delivered some feedback that was not necessarily implemented in the final instructional module, however, may be addressed in the future. It is unfortunate that this student did not learn that the document is a top-level object, and they also stated that they did not learn how to look at the documentation. These two KCs being very critical for success, not only in the near transfer task of updating a shopping cart value, as you saw on the EAMSILE website, but also in all JavaScript development. Second student stated that they enjoyed the step-by-step scaffolding, and they indicated that they found a bug in OLI, which was present throughout the summative assessment evaluations. And they also stated that although intertext was explained nicely, that they were unable to internalize the concept. This is a key takeaway from this student and also the previous, that some of these programming concepts must be reinforced further. Here's a sample of the instruction where I transitioned from updating the DOM and binding events to functions into the variable types in JavaScript module. At the end of the third video, adding strings as ints, I ask what went wrong when we tried to update our cart value, priming students to ask the question themselves after viewing what had happened in that a string appends to a string rather than a number on the shopping cart incrementing as you would expect it to do. The results of this instruction are not very encouraging. There were 4 students in the control and 8 students in the experimental portion of this instruction, which featured Parsons problems. The pretest scores of the version B participants were significantly higher. However, the post-test scores were exactly the same in terms of mean. There was no significant effect size, and it is rather telling, I think, that there were not enough performance tasks featured in this instruction, and that may have been the reason why the Parsons problems condition did not exceed the control condition in terms of student learning. However, that is up to future tasks. Moving forward, I think that you can see the assessment here on the right. Moving forward, I think that the DOM needs to be bridged to JavaScript using document, and that should definitely be elaborated upon in future lessons. In question 4, when students used the parseInt function, they passed empty parameters, which was not how that function was introduced. I think that also needs to be further reinforced, along with looking at the documentation for accessing values within elements, such as in question 9. Lastly, question number 10 would probably be served well by improving the wording. However, one student did manage to stack complex KCs, applying both inner HTML and parseInt correctly in their answer to that question. I'd also like to include more feedback consistently throughout the lesson and potentially more hints, although I would rather reinforce learning by telling students to look up the documentation and having them actually write the code that is relevant to succeeding in the task at hand. This course could definitely be expanded further by including foundational web development concepts and skills, matching PUI lab exactly, including concepts of scope and also local storage, which is how you store variables in the browser, and also including debugging KCs, although this could definitely be an entirely separate course. Some quotes from some students included one student who was a total novice at software development, and they had to guess many of the answers. A second student further reinforcing the point that there should be more performance tasks, said that although it was very good instruction, they had a hard time remembering all the new information for the post-test. And one student who is a software developer and fairly advanced in software development stated that this was the best programming instruction that they had ever done. This is very encouraging, and I think I'll leave it on that note. Thank you for listening, and questions and feedback are definitely welcome.